When the remains of a young woman are found in an Iowa ditch, it takes decades for them to be identified. Determined to solve her murder, investigators piece together the short and heartbreaking life of the victim in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
As always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This case was suggested to us by the victim's daughter, Chrissy. Thank you for letting us know about your mom's unsolved case, Chrissy. We're so sorry for your loss, and we hope you receive the answers you've been waiting so long for soon. Also, a quick heads up. This episode contains discussion of child abuse and mention of sexual assault. Please listen with care. Wilma Nissen was last seen alive during the summer of 1978. She was 23 years old at the time and had recently relocated to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Wilma wasn't from Sioux Falls, though, or even from the Midwest at all. She'd grown up in San Francisco, where her early life had been chaotic, to say the very least. Reporting by Mark Mahoney for Northwest Iowa News explains that Wilma was born to parents who didn't want her and who were extremely neglectful. And according to reporting for the Sioux City Journal, when Wilma was only 8 years old, her mom walked out on the family home and never returned. This left 8-year-old Wilma and her disabled sister, who could neither hear nor speak, solely in their father's care.
It is an incredibly tragic upbringing.
Definitely, and trust me, the details are worse than you might imagine. According to what Wilma's daughter, Chrissy, has told Kilo News, as a young child, Wilma wasn't sent to school, was routinely locked inside of a closet, and wasn't taught many of the basic life skills that most of us take for granted. And investigators say this is no exaggeration. According to what former Lyon County, Iowa Sheriff Blythe Blumendahl explained to the Sioux City Journal, Wilma and her sister were routinely locked in a closet while their dad was at work. And eventually, when their dad lost his job, things got even worse. They lost their home, and the entire family ended up living out of a car.
Nothing could prepare you for that. That is such a tragedy.
Yeah, Wilma was forced to roam the streets for food, and while that was terrible, her disabled sister suffered an even crueler fate. She was locked in the car's trunk. As I mentioned, she was unable to hear or speak, and presumably, in the darkness of a locked trunk, she was unable to see either. So she was just in there in almost total sensory deprivation. I can only imagine what that would do to a child. Again, the girls were not sent to school, so they had no reprieve from their abysmal living situation. Until, that is, Child Protective Services became aware and got involved. That happened when Wilma was about 10 years old, at which point the family was still living out of a car. Wilma had not been taught to read, write, or even to eat with a fork. At that point, Wilma was removed from her biological family's custody and placed with a series of foster parents. A situation that, while an improvement over being locked in a closet or relegated to living on the streets out of a car, was chaotic in its own way. It wasn't that the first foster family Wilma was placed with didn't want to care for her. They did, but when her foster mom developed a debilitating medical condition, she became unable to care for Wilma or the other 2 foster children. Following this, Wilma was shuffled through several foster care homes before finally being placed with her final foster family at age 13. There, her foster parents, whose names were Alice and Vince, attempted to give Wilma the kind of stable home she'd never had before. And a quick side note here, unfortunately, I don't know what happened to Wilma's sister.
There's a lot to be said about the American foster care system. It's not the greatest system by any stretch of the imagination.
No, you hear horror stories.
There are few things that make me go, thank God these kids were put in foster care, but this is one of them.
Definitely. Despite Alice and Vince's care, though, Wilma's life never became easy. The extreme trauma of her early years haunted her as she grew into a young woman. She'd never experienced stability during her early formative years, and, unsurprisingly, it continued to elude her as she reached adulthood. As a very young woman, she experienced several brief marriages, at least some of which, and perhaps all, were highly exploitative. According to what police told reporter Jay Wetschreck for The Globe, one of her husbands, a guy named Donald Wellington, was, without a doubt, quote, pimping Wilma out, end quote. During their marriage, she was arrested several times on prostitution charges. In 2006, Sheriff Blumendahl of the Lyon County, Iowa Sheriff's Department spoke to a Sioux City Journal reporter regarding Wilma's arrest, stating that, quote, "You can't label her as a prostitute in today's time frame because in the 1970s, there's not a lot of aid you can sign up for. This girl's on the street. She had plenty of disabilities because of the way she was raised by her parents. What chance did she have from that day forward? Very little." End quote. So, of course, it remains true today that many sex workers who engage in the dangerous work of street-level sex for pay do so out of desperation. It is no one's first choice. But the point that Sheriff Blumendahl was emphasizing remains clear. Wilma turned to that work because she had little choice. It was a means of survival. The tumultuousness of Wilma's short life and even shorter relationships was reflected in the many names she went by. In addition to her given last name of Nissen, she went through periods of time where she was known by the following last names: Wellington, Irvin, Pizarro, and Belt. She also sometimes used the first name Amy or the nickname Boots. During her early adulthood, Wilma gave birth 3 times, first to 2 sons and then to a daughter. Each of her children were removed from her custody as infants and placed for adoption or into foster care. Her daughter, Chrissy, was adopted by the couple who had been Wilma's final foster parents, Alice and Vince.
It's one of those few wholesome pieces of the story to hold on to that her final foster parents were able to at least adopt her daughter.
Definitely. Now, eventually, Wilma left California. Not long before her death, she relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, with a man more than twice her age whose name was Charles Inman Belt. Many years later, investigators would locate Belt to ask him about Wilma, and he would tell them that, quote, "A prostitute asked him to drive Wilma from California to Atlanta because someone in California wanted to hurt her," end quote. That's according to an article for the Sioux City Journal. Belt would also tell investigators that Wilma left their Atlanta apartment in February of 1978, so just 2 weeks after her arrival in Atlanta and just a few months before her death, and that he never saw her again after that. And that may very well have been true. In fact, it probably was. Why Wilma left Atlanta, though, and the details of everything that followed isn't known. We do know, however, that she headed west, eventually landing in Sioux Falls, which is the largest city in South Dakota. There, she worked for an escort service known as Playgirls or Playmates. In her final months, she worked for them both as a dancer and as an escort, sometimes working at what reporting for Siouxland Proud News describes as sex parties. And then, at some point in June or July, she vanished. A few months later, in early October, her remains were found in a ditch along a rural road in western Lyon County, Iowa, near Lake Pahoja. This location is only about a half-hour's drive from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was a utility worker who made the discovery, stumbling upon her remains while laying underground cable. Although the ditch was just under 2 feet, or about 0.6 meters from the road, it was so overgrown with thick weeds that no one had noticed the body.
I can see it, but it's still shocking to hear.
Yeah, many people had driven right by it and had no idea. The utility worker summoned police, who removed the heavily decomposed, partially clothed body of a woman from the ditch. She was wearing white go-go boots, khaki pants, and a silver and gold-colored friendship ring. She was unclothed from the waist up, and her mandible was missing. Notably, her pants and underwear, although present, were only partially on her body. Specifically, they were wrapped around her left leg only. Investigators consider this an indication that a sex act, possibly an act of sexual assault, may have occurred just prior to Wilma's death.
Given the industry she was working in and what we know about her and the state of undress, I think it's definitely likely.
Sure, it's difficult to say whether she may have been performing work for a paying customer or whether it may have been an act of sexual assault. We'll probably never know. But either way, also notable is the fact that Wilma's feet were tied together with a length of braided hemp rope. According to reporting for the Sioux City Journal, investigators have determined that the rope had been used to drag Wilma's body into the ditch and that she had been killed beforehand elsewhere.
Okay.
The medical examiner who performed Wilma's autopsy noticed that her right elbow was dislocated, as was one of her cervical vertebrae. Because of the advanced decomposition, the examiner was unable to determine Wilma's exact cause of death. However, her manner of death was clear: homicide. For many years, decades actually, investigators didn't know who Wilma was. She was a Jane Doe and was interred beneath a headstone that read simply, "Unidentified female." Meanwhile, her daughter Chrissy grew up without her, wondering about the mom she'd never had a chance to meet.
It's really sad.
Yeah. When Chrissy had been adopted by her mom's former foster parents, Alice and Vince, the couple had been older already than most first-time grandparents, let alone parents. They'd been 65 and 71 years old, respectively, when they'd adopted her as a baby. Naturally, raising a child at that stage in their lives was a challenge.
I can only imagine, but I really do think these were people that just really wanted to help.
It sounds like it. Chrissy told a Sioux City Journal reporter that by the time she reached her teen years, she frequently clashed with her elderly adopted parents. And by that time, she'd also grown intensely curious about her biological mom and searched the family home, hoping to find adoption papers that might shed light on her identity. Her adoptive parents had always been secretive about her mom, but she was determined to find out who she'd been. Eventually, Chrissy managed to find a photo of her mom in the house. And when her adoptive parents found out, they told her flatly that they believed her mom, Wilma, was likely deceased. They took the photo away from Chrissy, but of course, that didn't stop her from wondering about her mom. She didn't resent her for not being around, but she wondered why she wasn't, and she longed to meet her if she was still alive. Unfortunately, Chrissy's elderly adoptive parents eventually decided that they couldn't handle raising a teen, and Chrissy became a ward of the court. She continued her search for her biological mom and eventually managed to get in touch with her biological dad. His name was Robert Irvin, and he was still around, living in California. Chrissy met up with him, and to her disappointment, he wasn't able to tell her much about her mom, who he of course hadn't seen or heard from in many years. Chrissy continued her search, but it wasn't until she was in her late 20s that she finally received news about her mom. It was not the news that she'd hoped for. Rather, it was news that in Iowa Jane Doe had finally been identified. She, Wilma, Chrissy's mom, had been deceased for decades. This, of course, was a significant emotional blow. Chrissy told the Sioux City Journal that she really wished she could have met her mom and that, quote, "I feel like I missed out on a part of me," end quote. By the time Chrissy finally learned what had happened to her mom, she was in a rough place in life herself. She didn't have the support of a family and was living out of her car, which didn't even run thanks to mechanical problems. Because of her tough financial situation, several months passed before she was able to finally make the long trip to Iowa to visit the grave of the mom she'd been missing for her entire life. When she did make it, she brought flowers, a bouquet of 12 roses, which were pink, just like her mom's pink granite headstone, and pieces of jewelry, including a ring engraved with the word love. She told the Sioux City Journal, quote, "I wish she could hear me. I wish I could talk to her. I wish she knew I loved her, even though I never met her," end quote. She also added, quote, "I feel like I've lost the last hope of having a family," end quote. As Chrissy was forced to come to terms with her mom's tragic death, Sheriff Blumendahl was trying to figure out how to solve it. Yes, he'd finally figured out Wilma's identity by comparing the fingerprints taken at her autopsy to fingerprints in the APHIS database. The prints had been a match for prints that had been taken decades ago in California during one of Wilma's prostitution arrests.
Honestly, I'm a little surprised they were able to actually match them because, as we've talked about before, early days of APHIS and fingerprint entries were very different than they are today. They weren't digitized. If I remember correctly, they were done by somebody by hand inputting the data.
It's very fortunate. However, Sheriff Blumendahl was not content with simply learning Wilma's identity. Now that he knew who she was, he wanted to know who'd killed her, who'd violently cut her life short at just 23, and who had deprived her daughter of the chance of ever meeting her mother. Despite the fact that the case was nearly 30 years old, he was determined to solve it, and there wasn't much he wasn't willing to try to make it happen. More on that next. And now, back to Wilma's story. When Lyon County, Iowa Sheriff Blumendahl finally managed to identify the Jane Doe whose remains had been found in a ditch in his jurisdiction nearly 30 years beforehand, the momentous discovery was really only the beginning of his investigation. Now that he knew who Wilma Nissen was, he was determined to solve the remaining mystery of who had killed her. It wouldn't be easy, though. By the time he became sheriff and inherited the case, it was old and decidedly cold. Speaking to the Sioux City Journal, he compared reopening the case to inheriting an old, run-down house. There was an incredible amount of work to do and a seemingly endless number of small mysteries he'd have to string together in order to make sense of Wilma's life and death.
It's a pretty apt analogy.
Yeah, he was up for the challenge, though, and so he got to work reviewing autopsy reports, old arrest records, and interviewing anyone and everyone he could identify who had known Wilma. He pieced his findings together in a paper timeline that eventually stretched over an entire wall of his office. He contemplated the case every day, and eventually he came to feel like Wilma was someone he knew well, even though they had never met. When people brought up Wilma's risky lifestyle, he told them that, quote, "A crime is a crime, regardless of who the victim is, regardless of who the bad guy is. They all deserve your best effort, and this will get our best effort, come hell or high water. And as far as I'm concerned, come hell or high water, this case will get solved, period. I accept nothing less." End quote.
As you know, normally I'm pretty critical of law enforcement agencies not giving it that same level of treatment.
Well, a lot of unsolved cold cases simply haven't received this level of treatment and scrutiny, and if they had, many of them wouldn't be unsolved.
Exactly. So I really appreciate that despite her risky behavior, he is willing to go out of his way to do this, and he did go out of his way for this. It's reassuring to hear about officers still taking that level of care and that level of discernment with it.
Right. This is exactly the kind of professional we all would want investigating a case if it was one of our loved ones.
Exactly.
Now, for the record, Sheriff Blumendahl, he served for a long time. He's no longer sheriff, and although the case is, of course, unsolved, he made tremendous progress, and it may very well be solved because of his efforts. Anyway, Sheriff Blumendahl knew that when Wilma had died in 1978, the importance of DNA evidence hadn't yet been well known among law enforcement. It wasn't until 1986, nearly a decade after Wilma's murder, that DNA evidence had first been used to secure a criminal conviction in an American court. And that was too bad because Wilma had very possibly fought back against whoever had killed her. Her dislocated elbow and cervical vertebrae suggested a violent struggle. So, in 2007, nearly 30 years after Wilma's death, Sheriff Blumendahl made a decision. He would exhume Wilma's body in hopes of being able to collect DNA evidence. Even after so many years, there was still a possibility that her killer's DNA could be somewhere on her body, perhaps under her fingernails, for example.
Yeah, when we had your brother Jake on, we even discussed that with him.
Yeah, we did discuss that recently, actually, in our Bobby Brown episode. Now, Sheriff Blumendahl also planned to have a forensic anthropologist examine Wilma's remains in an effort to determine her exact cause of death, which had never been known. In order to move forward with the exhumation, though, he needed the approval of Wilma's next of kin, which was, of course, her daughter Chrissy. Chrissy also badly wanted her mom's case to be solved, so she agreed. However, when they exhumed Wilma's body, there was a problem. The state had provided an inexpensive casket for her burial. Her remains had been laid to rest in a body bag, which had been placed inside of that casket. However, the weight of the earth and the passage of time had taken a toll on the casket, and it had broken down. Water had made its way into the body bag, about 50 gallons or approximately 190 liters worth.
That is a lot of water.
It's a tremendous amount. Sheriff Blumendahl, with help from other professionals, carefully strained all of the water out of the body bag and allowed Wilma's remains to dry. They knew that the water had potentially destroyed any DNA evidence. Still, in case any had been left intact, they were determined to try. By the time of the exhumation, Sheriff Blumendahl had narrowed down his pool of persons of interest to just 8 individuals. He hoped to recover DNA evidence via the exhumation that would definitively identify a suspect or suspects. However, American scientists weren't able to extract DNA profiles from Wilma's remains, likely because of the water damage. Undeterred, Sheriff Blumendahl looked beyond the U.S. and sought out cutting-edge DNA technology. He ended up hiring a Scandinavian company, and their scientists were able to extract multiple DNA profiles via a process known as DNA amplification.
That is shocking, and also it goes to just further show how committed he was.
Right. If I had an award for most dedicated investigator to give to any of the investigators we've talked about in this podcast ever over the years, it would probably be given to him. So basically, DNA amplification is the process of producing multiple copies of a DNA sample until there's enough that the sample can be characterized. And currently, amplified DNA is not supported by CODIS. So the DNA extracted in this case can't be used to find Wilma's killer in that way, at least not yet. In the future, as technology advances, that could potentially change.
Yeah, we've talked about it a number of times. With DNA, we're at this point where we know so much about it and we're making these tremendous jumps all the time, but we're still just kind of waiting for technology to catch up to what we can do with it.
Right. Great things are happening now, but when it comes to DNA analysis, the future is even brighter, for sure. In any case, for now, I would be remiss not to note that according to reporting by Angela Kneck for Kilo News, those Scandinavian scientists didn't just locate one person's DNA. They found more than one individual's. Now, as I mentioned, the hope of recovering DNA evidence had not been the only reason for the autopsy. Sheriff Blumendahl had also hoped that a forensic anthropologist would be able to finally identify Wilma's exact cause of death. In fact, he'd had a lot more confidence that that would occur than he had in the potential location of DNA evidence. And fortunately, a forensic anthropologist had been able to do exactly that. Investigators now know exactly how Wilma was murdered, but they have not shared that information with the public for the sake of the investigation. They say it's something that only the killer or a witness would know.
Okay.
Armed with information regarding the cause of Wilma's death, not to mention insight Sheriff Blumendahl had obtained from an FBI behavioral analyst, investigators made progress. And in 2009, so about 2 years after the exhumation, they made an arrest related to this case.
I'm a little apprehensive because they've made an arrest, but it's still unsolved.
Well, let me explain. The person they arrested was an 82-year-old man named John W. Van Gemeren. He lived in rural Lyon County, Iowa, which is the county where Wilma's remains had been found in that ditch, of course. He'd been living there for many years, including in the late 70s when Wilma had been killed. Back then, Van Gemeren had allegedly been involved in the local sex trade in some capacity, including the sex parties that Wilma had been known to work. Investigators questioned him about his involvement, but he was less than forthcoming. In fact, investigators say that he lied to them. According to reporting for Kilo News, investigators eventually charged Van Gemeren with, quote, 6 counts of perjury for lying to investigators about transporting strippers and prostitutes from Sioux Falls to his northwest Iowa home, end quote.
Okay, so not a direct arrest.
Basically, they arrested him because he was lying to them during the investigation, or so they say, and it sounds like his home had probably been the location of some of these parties. However, he was never convicted. The charges were later dismissed. Furthermore, that Kilo News article states that Van Gemeren was not a suspect in Wilma's murder. And reading between the lines here, it sounds like investigators thought that he may have been some sort of witness.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, investigators say they never got much information out of Van Gemeren, and he's now deceased. That's not to say that investigators haven't been able to identify any potential suspects, though. Over the years, they've actually identified several. One of those potential suspects was a man named Robert Ben Rhodes. Rhodes was a serial killer, specifically a highway serial killer.
Okay, those are difficult to narrow down.
Yes, we've discussed highway serial killers on this show before, but for anyone unaware, they're serial killers who work as long-haul truckers. The term highway serial killer was coined by the FBI, who developed an entire initiative focusing on them beginning in 2009. They did this because they believed that there are hundreds of killers who have used or who are currently using long-haul trucking as camouflage for their crimes. Their official estimate, as of 2021, was that there have been about 450 individual highway serial killers in the U.S., with dozens of them still currently active.
That's a big number.
It is surprisingly large, in fact. I think that every time I hear it anyway. Now, that's just an estimate, but it's an estimate that comes from FBI personnel who work on this highly specialized initiative.
Yes.
Now, of course, most long-haul truckers are perfectly normal and decent people. There is nothing about being a trucker that drives someone to kill. Rather, it's the other way around. Killers may be attracted to the long-haul trucking profession because it provides an excuse to constantly be on the move, offending in many different jurisdictions, which makes it easier not to get caught. Which is exactly why the FBI developed the Highway Serial Killings Initiative to identify connected killings all across the country, irrespective of jurisdiction.
I just looked up a quick number just to kind of wrap our head around this, because the 450 number sounds like a lot, but before anybody says we're attacking truckers or says that we're trying to skew anything, There's over 3 million commercial drivers as of 2023, according to an article posted by truckinfo.net concerning statistics about truck drivers.
And is that 3 million currently active drivers?
I believe so.
Okay, keep in mind that that 450 number is how many highway serial killers the FBI believes have ever been active in the U.S. And it's only a few dozen that they believe are active now. So out of several million professional commercial drivers, we might have a few dozen who are serial killers. That is a very, very, very small percentage.
Exactly. But I can also see why it would be so lucrative. I mean, often after committing a murder, the murderer will move or leave the area. It gives them more safety. It gives them more security. They're no longer around where the murder happened.
Right, and that's exactly why some killers have been drawn to the profession. Now, when it comes to those rare individuals who are highway serial killers and not just regular truck drivers, Robert Ben Rhodes was one of them. He was a long-haul trucker who investigators say was actively killing during the years 1989 and 1990, at least. And you've probably heard of his crimes, even if you don't recognize his name. There's a very famous photo of a dark-haired teen girl in a long-sleeved black top holding up her hands in an effort to ward off her killer inside of a barn just moments before her death. Her name was Regina K. Walters. She was only 14, and she was one of Robert Ben Rhodes' victims. Her remains were eventually found in the barn where the photo was taken, and for her murder, Rhodes was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. In addition to Regina's murder, Rhodes was charged with the double murder of a couple in their 20s. Their names were Candace Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski. However, investigators suspect that Rhodes, who built a torture chamber into the cab of his truck, by the way, may have had more victims.
If he's going that far,
yeah,
I would be shocked if that was how limited his victim pool was.
Same here. A 1996 article published in the Tucson Weekly states that investigators believed, at the time, that Rhodes had, quote, been killing an average of 3 women a month by the early 1990s, end quote. And according to a 2024 article published in the Des Moines Register, Rhodes is believed to have taken as many as 50 victims' lives. Although we may never know the true number of victims he targeted, it's apparent that investigators are confident that it was significantly more than 3. And Scott, I'm sure you noticed that the years during which we know Rhodes was active, 1989 and 1990, are just over a decade later than when Wilma was killed in 1978.
Yes.
Now, keep in mind, though, that we don't know for sure when Rhodes began killing. And when it comes to why investigators were suspicious of him in relation to Wilma's case, well, there was a good reason. At the time of Wilma's death, Rhodes was living in Sioux Falls.
When we're talking about these long haul or serial killers that move around a lot, interactions between agencies are not always the best, which is why the FBI has this resource now. Mm-hmm. But that obviously wasn't available in the 70s.
Right. Or the 80s or the 90s.
Exactly. As you said, we don't know when he started, but he could have even started out prior to being a long-haul trucker.
Yeah,
and
certainly.
If he's living in that area, that definitely seems like a very plausible place to look.
Yeah, so for all these reasons, decades after Wilma's death, investigators traveled to an Illinois prison in order to interview him regarding his potential involvement in Wilma's murder. However, after interviewing Rhodes, investigators were convinced that he had not been responsible for Wilma's death. He's been ruled out as a suspect, essentially. And investigators would eventually determine that the real suspects were likely people Wilma knew, people living lives very similar to hers. According to a 2016 article by Tim Seaman for SiouxlandProud.com, investigators believe that 2 women were involved in Wilma's death.
That's surprising.
Yeah, statistically speaking, this is unusual. Men commit about 90% of murders in the U.S., and on the relatively rare occasions when women commit murder, they usually do not kill during the course of a robbery. And yet, that's exactly what investigators believe happened in Wilma's case.
Okay.
The 2 women who investigators believe were involved in Wilma's death were known as Peaches and Sugar. Those were only stage names, though. Like Wilma, Peaches and Sugar were sex workers. Investigators know Sugar's legal name. They simply have not shared it with the public. As for Peaches, though, well, according to the most recent reporting I could locate, they still haven't been able to determine her identity. In any case, investigators have interviewed Sugar many times. She's never admitted to any involvement in Wilma's death, but investigators don't buy her denial. Sugar and Peaches, they say, were both known at the time for robbing other sex workers. Scott, you know those sex parties that Wilma was working at in Sioux Falls just before her death?
Yes.
Well, according to reporting by Mark Mahoney for Northwest Iowa News, investigators believe Wilma's death was likely tied directly to one of those parties. In fact, they think it occurred at one of those parties.
Okay, the piece that I've been trying to couple together here was the potential sexual exploitation.
Right. So there is some evidence to suggest, based off of the positioning of Wilma's clothing, that she may have been involved in or subjected to some kind of sex act shortly before her death. If that death occurred at one of these parties, she may have been having a consensual encounter with a paying client. Or, it could be an act of sexual assault. We simply don't know. Now, Wilma, Peaches, and Sugar, who investigators believe killed Wilma, Sugar specifically, that is, were all working for the escort agency that staffed those parties back in 1978. Investigators believe that Sugar killed Wilma at that party and that at least one other person, probably Peaches, was also involved in some capacity. Furthermore, immediately after Wilma's murder, Sugar, in a classic killer move, fled town, heading for Canada.
Very classic.
Yeah, and once there, she actually stabbed someone and then had to flee Canada, returning to the U.S. So clearly she's a violent person. Investigators say that although they know who Sugar is and have interviewed her, they're withholding her legal name for the sake of the investigation. They're waiting for a knowledgeable member of the public to come forward and identify her and basically confirm what they already believe they know. On that note, we've posted a picture of Sugar on our website. Please take a look. The link is in the show notes. And of course, if you know who she is, reach out to investigators. Investigators have accomplished a great deal in this case, and they say they firmly believe that there are residents of the Lyon County area who know exactly what happened to Wilma. There are people who were there, probably. However, they've had a hard time getting people to come forward because most people don't want to admit to attending a sex party, period, let alone one where someone was murdered.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk involved with that.
For sure, there's risk, there's just taboos, even if they didn't do anything criminal. But people coming forward is exactly what investigators need to finally close this case. Wilma's daughter, Chrissy, is still waiting for justice and doing everything within her power to make it happen. She's told Kilo News that, quote, "The more people that hear her story, the more likely it is. They're so close. It feels like they're so close. Just one little thing could solve this. The more people that hear it, the better the odds. She deserves to have justice. Whoever did this to her deserves to face justice," end quote. And investigators at the Lyon County Sheriff's Office take the case personally as well. For decades, up until they were finally able to identify Wilma, they called her simply our girl. If you know anything about the death of Wilma Nissen, please call the Lyon County Sheriff's Office at 712-472-8300.
Yeah, I really appreciate Chrissy being the one to bring this case to our attention. It really does draw us into that very personal aspect of her life. It's touching.
Right, and like she said, the more people hear this story, the more likely it is that someone will come forward with something that they know. So for Wilma and Chrissy's sake, please share this episode with your family and friends, particularly if you live in the Lyon County, Iowa area.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Wilma's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Don't forget to check our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.